All right, in order to make the meeting today more accessible, we have enabled live transcription. So if you would like to see closed captions, click the closed caption button near the lower middle of your Zoom window, and you can adjust the font size of closed captioning based on your preferences. During this meeting, we do encourage you to ask questions and provide input. We will have dedicated time for questions and input, but you're welcome to ask those at any time. You can participate either by raising your hand and speaking or by using the chat function. To access the chat, you'll click the chat button near the lower middle of your Zoom window. And to raise your hand, you'll click the reactions button near the lower right of your Zoom window, and then click raise hand. After you have spoken, click raise hand again to lower your hand. And if you're calling in today via phone, you can still raise your hand by dialing *9. After you've spoken, you'll dial *9 once again to lower your hand. And finally, you can see that there's a little window with videos of the presenters that might be covering part of your Zoom screen. If you ever feel like you can't read all of a slide because the video is blocking part of the slide, you can simply click and drag this video window to move it to a different part of your screen. With that, I'll hand it over to Bill Flagg, the lead for this rulemaking and our first presenter.
Thank you, Nick. So here's a list of topics for discussion today at our meeting. First, we're going to be doing a March meeting recap based off of our March 30th meeting. We'll have a few slides just kind of giving an overview of what we covered during the last meeting. And then we will be covering some proposed definitions that we're bringing forth today in order to gather any feedback from you all on that. And then we'll jump into some record-keeping requirements that we're proposing that we'd like to get some input on as well. After that, we'll take a 10-minute break. And once we reconvene, we'll discuss some proposed reporting requirements, as well as the landfill heat input capacity calculation, which will be part of those requirements. And then we'll finish it off with some next steps and important dates coming up. Okay, so for our March 30th meeting recap, we discussed the overall purpose of our rulemaking. We also gave an overview of our authorizing statute or law, Chapter 70A 540 RCW. We discussed extensively applicability to this rulemaking. And we also brought forth a couple definitions that relate to exemptions for the rulemaking, namely exemptions for CERCLA regulated landfills, as well as exemptions for inert waste landfills. Next slide, please. So the overall cover, once again, the overall purpose of our rulemaking here is to reduce methane emissions from landfills in our state. Our state will join California and Oregon in implementing more protective standards for decreasing emissions from these sources. This will ultimately help us achieve our GHG emissions reductions goals, which are 95% below 1990 levels by 2050. Next slide, please. Chapter 70A 540 RCW is our authorizing statute. This will impact municipal solid waste landfills that received solid waste after January 1st, 1992. It'll impact, I should say, it may impact different landfills in numerous ways. Some of those ways will be new reporting and record-keeping requirements, which we'll be discussing today. Monitoring requirements, gas collection control system installation and performance requirements, penalties for violation of law and implemented rules, as well as some other requirements. And our projected timeline for implementation of this rule, as it stands right now, is January 1st, 2025, but this is subject to change. Okay, last meeting on March 30th, we covered these two process flow slides for applicability for both active and closed landfills, and we covered it pretty extensively. I'm going to go through it a little quicker today, but these slides will be posted online. They were also posted in our in our last presentation. For active landfills, if it's not a municipal solid waste landfill, is automatically exempt from the requirements of this chapter. The next question is if the municipal solid waste landfill received solid waste after 1992. If not, it's also exempt from the chapter. For active landfills that have less than 450,000 tons of waste in place, there will be an annual waste in place reporting requirement. And these landfills will have to report on this until such a time if and when they reach 450,000 tons of waste in place. For active landfills that have passed this threshold, there will be a landfill gas heat input capacity calculation, as well as reporting requirements for that. And we're going to discuss that more extensively later in this presentation. And these landfills will have to do that. They'll have to recalculate their landfill heat input capacity until they either close or until they breach this 3 million BTUs per hour recovered limit. Landfills that have breached this limit then will have a quarterly surface monitoring requirement, and this is for consecutive quarterly monitoring periods. So any landfill that shows over the course of 4 consecutive quarterly monitoring periods that it doesn't have 200 parts per million by volume of surface methane will have to go back and still do their landfill gas heat input capacity. Landfills that have passed this 200 parts per million by volume surface methane measurement as determined by instantaneous surface monitoring, and this could be for any one of those monitoring periods over the 4 quarterly consecutive monitoring periods, will have to install a gas collection and control system. Next slide, please. For closed municipal solid waste landfills, the requirements are much the same, but there's a couple key differences. First, if it's not a MSW landfill, then it is exempt from this rulemaking. Next, if the closed landfill did not receive solid waste after January 1st, 1992, it is also exempt. The big number here we're looking at for closed landfills is 750,000 tons of waste in place. If the closed landfill does not hit this 750,000 tons of waste in place threshold, it's automatically exempt from this chapter, this rulemaking. So we're only looking at landfills that have greater than or equal to 750,000 tons of waste in place. Those landfills will have to calculate their heat input capacity, and they'll have to do so. Landfills that have less than 3 million will have to do so annually. We're still creating some rules around this annual requirement for closed landfills, but some of these closed landfills still might be on their methanogenic curve. So they might still be generating methane years after they've closed. So that's why there is a requirement for an annual heat input capacity calculation. For a closed landfill that conducts instantaneous surface monitoring, this will be another requirement. If they can show over the course of 4 consecutive quarterly monitoring periods that they don't have any concentration of 200 parts per million by volume of surface methane, these closed landfills no longer have to follow the requirements of the statute in this rulemaking. These landfills will essentially be out. For closed landfills that do breach this 200 parts per million by volume surface methane, this could be, once again, over any one of these quarterly monitoring periods, these closed landfills will have to install a gas collection and control system. Next slide, please. We also covered during the last meeting some definitions that we had drafted in regard to exemptions. One of those was the CERCLA definition. I'm not going to read through the slide, but we do have this draft rule language posted on our webpage, and of course we welcome you all to continue to submit input either online or by reaching out to me on some of our drafted rule language, such as the CERCLA definition. Next slide, please. We also drafted a definition for inert waste landfills. And we pulled this definition, an inert waste landfill as defined is the same as an inert waste landfill in WAC 173, 350, 100. Once again, we would like input on these definitions. This drafted rule language is already on our webpage now. Next slide, please. Okay, so on to today's agenda, today's meeting purpose and objectives. First is to answer any of your questions about this statute and rulemaking, any general questions you might have. We also would like to seek your input on some more proposed definitions that we're bringing forth today. And lastly, we'd like to seek your input on key decision points for reporting and record keeping requirements of this rulemaking, which we'll be covering quite extensively today. So this is a list of definitions as defined in our statute. So these will not change. These are statutory definitions. I did not want to write them all out because it would take up a lot of slides, but you can find this through the link on the bottom right here of this slideshow. Also, I can put a link to our statute in the chat right now. It looks like it's already up there. If you want to browse through these definitions, it's section 010. Next slide, please. This is a list of proposed definitions. These are non-statutory definitions. We've drafted these definitions. There will be 4 or 5 slides that we will be listing out verbatim the language that we've drafted after this slide here, and those definitions we felt were a little more consequential to this rulemaking and would garner more interest. There's a lot of definitions to cover, so we didn't want to go slide through slide, just going through all drafted language for each definition. But these are some of our proposed definitions, and you will be able to see this on our webpage when we post our draft rule language, which will likely be early next week. And of course, we'd like to gather your input on these definitions that we've drafted. So some of these definitions, as I mentioned, we were thinking we'd garner some interest, so we wanted to go through them. The first one being component leak. Component leak means the concentration of methane measured 1/2 of an inch or less from a component source that exceeds 500 parts per million by volume. This is other than non-repeatable momentary readings. Measurements from any vault must be taken within 3 inches above the surface of the vault exposed to the atmosphere. Are there any questions or feedback at this time for our proposed definition on component leak?
And as a reminder, you're welcome to participate using the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you. Yes, Heather.
So to be clear and understand this, you're talking about if there's an existing pipeline or infrastructure and you're looking for a specific leak out of that, as opposed to when you say component leak.
Yes, Heather, that's exactly right. These are leaks from gas collection and control system components. And to expand on that, as far as methane exceedances go, based on our statutory language, our exceedance limits are 500 parts per million by volume of instantaneous surface monitoring. So this is kind of an extension of that, making sure that any sort of gas collection and control system equipment is also not leaking, in addition to just landfill surface. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, the reason I bring this up is because of the issue of using drones. We think that drones should be used, and I'm thinking drones on like the open face and things like that. And that's why I was trying to get clarity on the like if this is like you're down on the ground, you're trying to like figure out where exactly the leak is versus you're seeing a leak coming generally from an area, which a drone would pick up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of these, instantaneous surface monitoring measurements are taken using a hydrocarbon detector. So these, we are proposing these limits of, for example, 3 inches above the surface of these components. I can't really speak to drones specifically at this time, though. Is there anything else, Heather?
Well, let's talk about that more when we get to the more of your definitions. We do think that drones should be kind of some of the standard practice and required. But let's get on with. I don't want to derail you here on this particular one.
All right. Well, thanks for your question. Okay, on to the next definition here. In the last definition, component leak, there was an exemption, so to speak, for non-repeatable momentary readings. So we wanted to further define this term as well. And this is how we're defining it. Non-repeatable momentary readings means indications of the presence of methane which persist for less than 5 seconds and do not recur when the sampling probe of a portable gas detector is placed in the same location. So for something like a component leak or an exceedance, these non-repeatable momentary readings are not exceedances. Are there any questions or feedback on this definition at this moment?
Heather, is your hand still up from your previous comment?
Yes.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm not seeing anything in the chat or any hands raised. And again, you don't have to provide us live feedback during the meeting today. You're also welcome to take some time, mull things over, and then provide your comments online. And we'll be sure to share how to do that at the end of the meeting today.
All right, on to the next definition. Thanks, Nick. So we wanted to bring forth a proposed definition on an exceedance. This is similar to component leak, but an exceedance, it might not just occur just from a component leak standpoint, an exceedance from gas collection and control system equipment. An exceedance can also be an exceedance of methane emissions from a landfill surface. And this relates to Section 5 of our statutory language. And once again, the statute link is posted on the chat here. So you can check out Section 5 if you want, which says that a methane exceedance means an exceedance of 500 parts per million by volume of instantaneous surface monitoring. And this is other than non-repeatable momentary readings, or 25 parts per million by volume as determined by integrated surface emissions monitoring. So these numbers, 525, are pulled from our statute. So we did not come up with these numbers. It is the language of our law, our authorizing law. But an exceedance in this case is measured within 3 inches above the landfill surface. Are there any questions, or it looks like we got a question from Heather here.
Well, a comment. These are like kind of broadly defining the landfill surface versus actually talking about the active working area and any kind of definition of that, which is where we'd be expecting, you know, a lot of the issue to come from. So I'm not sure about the next definitions you're going to be bringing up, but this is something that we're going to be commenting on, is sort of defining these things a little bit more, just so there are definitions that are clear on these things, like the open phase and things like that, working phase, active phase.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for your comment, Heather. You know, in our statutory language as it stands, these exceedances take place throughout the landfill, except for a few areas. And one of those areas is the working phase, because these landfills will be actively working on this phase throughout the day. We have come up with a working phase, a proposed definition, which we will be sharing online with our drafted rule language. Some of those other areas, which we'll be covering a little bit throughout this presentation, are either the working phase or landfill disturbances because of modification or installation of gas collection and control system equipment, law enforcement activities, which is also part of our statutory language, and active mining for minerals and metals. But of course, we welcome more comments on this.
All right.
Okay.
I'll move us on to the next slide.
Okay, lastly, we are bringing forth a proposed definition on heat input capacity. And we drafted this definition because the heat input capacity calculation is a requirement for some landfills that are impacted by this rulemaking. And we are defining this as meaning the hourly heat content available on a steady state basis in the form of landfill gas generated from a landfill's waste source material. So that is our proposed definition for heat input capacity. And we will be covering heat input capacity, including a calculation in a little bit more extensive way later on in this presentation, as well as some of the reporting requirements around it. Does anyone have any comments or feedback on our proposed definition for heat input capacity? It's like we have a question in our chat from Stephen, which is, can we discuss what steady state means? Thanks for your question, Stephen. I think I'm gonna pass that question off to our engineering staff here, if one of them wants to jump in and explain the basis behind the steady state.
Yeah, as soon as I figure out where my buttons are. So to calculate this, I'm going to explain this later in the presentation. There's a lot of stuff that goes into how a landfill operates and what generates the energy. So the steady state is just what you put into it and the meteorological conditions that are there overall, and how that's like the calculation that comes out of that, basically. So there's no like taking the averages of how much waste you put into place, like what percentage of that is organic, the average temperatures you get, that's like that steady input that would calculate your heat generation. Does that answer it? Your question?
Yeah, it helps. I think waiting to see what you say later in the presentation may be more useful. Thanks.
Oh, okay, no problem.
Well, thanks, Catherine, and thanks for your question, Stephen. So those are the definitions that we're bringing forth today. And once again, we had a slide where we went through a list of definitions that, you know, I didn't read verbatim today. Those definitions will be on our website as drafted rule language, and of course we welcome further input on that. So we're going to move on to record keeping requirements, unless there are any other questions or comments on definitions. Okay, so this slide right here, this is statutory language of our authorizing law around record keeping requirements, and it states that the owner or operator of a municipal solid waste landfill must maintain records related to monitoring, testing, landfill operations, and the operation of the gas control device, collection system, and control system. The records must be provided by the owner or operator to the department or local authority within 5 business days of a request from the department or local authority. So we've drafted some rule language around some of these bounds here, including monitoring, testing, landfill operations, operation of gas control device, collection system. Because this is statutory language, this 5 days of a 5 business days of a request from a department or local authority will be a sticking point when we develop this rule. So there are, we have many proposed record keeping requirements at this time. And instead of going through a list of every sort of record keeping requirement that we already have drafted up, we felt it was easier to break these down into columns and buckets here, and 3 different major buckets. And we'll expand on some of these points, but these are these general buckets here cover most of the record keeping requirements. And once again, this drafted rule language on the actual language surrounding these record keeping requirements will be posted on our webpage, likely early next week, so we can receive more input and feedback from you all on this. Our first bucket, so to speak, is landfill operations, and you can see this is a color-coded system. The reason why we did that is we broke them down into subcategories. So you can see, for instance, waste in place. There will be some record-keeping requirements for waste in place, and these include an annual solid waste in place acceptance rate, as well as records on current waste in place. Next, we have records of areas excluded from the collection system. These might be areas of a landfill that are exempt from these requirements, like sections of a landfill that contain inert waste that are not generating methane. So records on these areas excluded from the system. And another example of that could be CERCLA, any CERCLA response actions at a landfill that are separate from areas of the landfill that contain municipal solid waste. So we want records on these areas where there aren't any wells or any sort of collection of gas. These records should contain the nature, location, amount, and date of deposition of non-degradable waste. We'll also be looking at records of surface disturbance. And when I say surface disturbance, I mean four different things that we've kind of drafted so far. And this, of course, is subject to change as we're still drafting our rule language. But surface disturbance, as it stands now, means disturbance based on installing, expanding, or replacing or repairing components of a landfill cover system, the landfill gas collection and control system, the leachate collection and removal system, or a landfill gas condensate collection and removal system. So an owner or operator will be required to keep records on any sort of surface disturbance on the landfill. Another category of landfill surface disturbance is for active mining of minerals and metals. And the bit on active mining is actually in our statutory language under the exceedances section in section 5. Another category of landfill surface disturbance is construction activities. And we've further defined that in our drafted rule language. And lastly, any sort of landfill surface disturbance because of law enforcement activities. And these disturbances will be requiring records of what the activity is, the time and date of the activity, location on the landfill, as well as mitigation measures to prevent the release of methane or to help control the release of methane. Are there any comments or questions at this time for some of these proposed record keeping requirements? Like we have a question from Kevin. Go ahead, Kevin.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so the landfill surface disturbance, does that also, if that's for an active landfill, correct?
Yeah. This will apply
Okay.
to active and closed landfills, but of course, some of these will be more applicable to active landfills.
So as you're building your landfill and you go back over and you scarify a lift to create hydraulic conductivity, when you put another lift on top of a closed portion, is that going to have to be recorded? Or you dig up an area to, like we take animals here, we have to dig up holes for them. Is that going to have to be recorded, that kind of stuff?
As of right now, we've drafted language around just the 4 buckets that I've covered. This could be subject to change, but the goal of this is to be getting records of any sort of landfill surface disturbance other than the working phase. So at this time, I don't have an answer for you on that. But of course, we would be willing to look at some other categories that might fall under landfill surface disturbance. And I do want to add, Kevin, that if you send a written comment on this, that'll help us kind of come up with some suggestions based around what you said.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to the methane bucket here. So we will be requiring records of any methane exceedances. This is kind of broken up into 2 categories. We have and I discussed this earlier when I was going through the applicability slides. We have our exceedance of 200 parts per million by volume or greater of instantaneous surface monitoring. This is the quarterly monitoring which decides whether an active or closed landfill has to install a gas collection and control system. So there'll be an exceedance based on that limit there. For landfills that already have their gas collection and control system set up, as well as, any landfill that will be impacted by this rulemaking once implementation begins. We have our exceedance limits of 500 parts per million by volume of surface methane as determined by instantaneous surface monitoring, as well as 25 parts per million as determined by integrated surface monitoring. And these records should include a leak location on the landfill, the concentration, a date, time, mitigation measures to control the release of methane, any sort of remonitoring that has taken place, and wind speed during sampling. And also under methane, we have just general records for monitoring.
Bill, I see that Marnie has commented in the chat. I'm just going to read that out loud, which is, will you be requiring sampling during time when barometric pressure is trending stable to falling?
Great, thanks for your question, Marnie. Once again, I'm gonna pass that one off to technical staff here who can maybe help me out with this.
So no, the only caveats we have for barometric pressure or weather is taking measurements more than 72 hours after recent rain. We do not reference barometric pressure in our draft right now. But if you have some good comments or some good research to point us to, we appreciate written comments.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks for your question, Marnie. Any other question or comments on record keeping requirements for this methane column that I just went through? Okay, on to the gas collection and control system record keeping requirements. We are looking at some record keeping requirements for wellheads, and this will include positive gauge pressure, wellhead measurements, and any corrective actions taken to solve that. Operating parameters of the gas collection and control system, and this includes any shutdown time for both the gas collection system and the control system, as well as the reason for the shutdown time. Same applies to wellheads, individual wellhead shutdowns, the reason for the wellhead shutdown and the time and how long it was shut down for. For enclosed flares, we're looking at any combustion temperatures 50 degrees below the required operating standards, and if this exceeds 3+ hours of these flares operating at that temperature. In regard to control devices, we'll be requiring records for destruction efficiency, as well as stack and source tests. And this next slide here, we will be covering more elements of this control device because there's quite a number of records as it stands right now required for each control device, for the operation of each control device for its life. So next slide, please, Nick. The owner operator must maintain the following records for the life of each gas control device as measured during the initial source test or compliance determination. These records include control device vendor specs, expected gas generation flow, % reduction of methane achieved by each gas control device, boiler or process heater performance test. And then for open flares, you can see there's a number of records associated with the operation of open flares. And these include visible emission readings, heat content determination, flow rate or bypass flow rate, exit velocity determinations, flare pilot monitoring, pilot flame or flare flame absence during the operation of an open flare. Are there any questions or comments on our proposed record keeping requirements for control devices?
I see a comment from Rod, so I'll read that out. Are the reporting requirements for generally pulled directly from the statute, or did you find it necessary to iterate on the statutory requirements to implement the rule? Could you highlight any areas where the requirements differ or expand on the statute?
Yes, thanks for your question, Rod. And if Nick, if you don't mind going back to I think it's maybe 4 slides back. Yeah, this one right here. So Rod, in regards to record keeping, this is the statutory language behind that. The owner or operator of a municipal solid waste landfill must maintain records related to monitoring, testing, landfill operations, and the operation of the gas control device, gas collection system, and gas control system. So within the statutory language, those are the bounds of records for all those categories. And so we have expanded on it with the last 2 slides. So we're basically expanding on records for, monitoring, control device, gas collection or control system, shutdown time, and all of the elements I covered in the last 2 slides. Does that answer your question? Great, thank you. It looks like we have a question here from John Dawson, and John's question is, does expected gas generation flow just apply to the present or to future projection of gas generation? That is a really good question, John, that I'm not able to answer. If anyone from my team knows this answer to this, please jump in.
Well, seeing as this is kind of pertaining, like we're looking at annual reporting requirements, we would look at the present projection. So how much gas you've projected to produce in your landfill for that calendar year, or during that calendar year, as opposed to projecting out like a couple years into the future. If that makes sense, John.
That does, thank you.
All right, thanks for your question, John. Are there any other questions on? It looks like we have a question from Heather. Heather, go ahead.
This really is a question. Can we take a bio break at the top of the hour?
Yeah, that is planned. So
That's the plan.
10-minute
Great.
break once we're done with this section. We might, it's 10:48 right now, so we might finish a little earlier than 11 before our break here. All right, Nick, on to the next slide. And you can see this beautiful picture here of a landfill with Mount Rainier in the background. Is there any other questions on what's been covered so far, or any input on some of the proposed language that we brought forth today?
All right, it looks like we've got a comment in the chat from Jennifer, which I'll read out. We reviewed record keeping requirements. Will we go into greater detail on the associated reporting requirements?
Yes, thanks for your question, Jennifer. Yeah, we are going to be covering reporting requirements in more detail here after our 10-minute break. Thanks for your question. Are there any more questions at this time?
I'm not seeing anything, Bill. And I see that it's 10:50 right now, so a sort of round time for us to move on to our break, if you think that sounds good.
Yeah, I think so. That puts us at 10 minutes earlier, so we're gonna take a 10-minute break here and reconvene at 11.
Sounds good. So feel free to get up, leave your screen, stretch your legs, grab some water, and we'll see you back here at 11. I'll also put that in the chat. All right, it's 11 a.m. now. And so I'll give everybody a moment to come back to their screens, get settled in. I hope that that was a restful break for you. And I'll pass it back off to, I believe, Catherine for the next section of the presentation. Nope. Yes? We'll see.
All right. Now we're going to get into the exciting stuff, the reporting requirements. This is a slide we had in our previous presentation. Just highlighting kind of like our tiers of reports that we have. So if you're an active landfill that has fewer than 450,000 tons of waste in place, you have to submit a waste in place report to the department or the local authority. If you have a landfill with 450,000 or more tons of waste in place, or a closed landfill with more or equal to 750,000 tons of waste in place, you have to prepare an annual report for your gas heat input capacity. And this annual report has to be submitted to the department and local authority during the subsequent calendar year. There's also an equipment removal report if you're removing equipment within 30 days of well capping or removal of cessation of operation of your GCCS. Or if you are closing your landfill, you're ceasing to accept waste, you must submit a closure notification to the department or the local authority. Next slide. So here is how we've kind of visually organized our required reports. So you have your equipment removal report, you're removing pieces of equipment. You've got your closure notification report, top and bottom. Okay. The annual report is envisioned as, and you have to submit an annual report, but you have different tiers of what you're required to submit in the annual report, depending on the size of your landfill. So starting off, the smallest landfills waste in place report, moving on once you break that tonnage threshold to landfill gas heat input capacity report, where you no longer have to do your waste in place. And then once you hit the threshold of 3 BTUs per hour of heat generation, then you move into instantaneous surface monitoring or GCCS operations, depending on where you're at your landfill. Next slide, please. Okay, so our proposed annual reporting requirements, we have our basic threshold for everything that we want to see in the report. Basic paper keeping requirements, like you're submitting a paper to your elementary school teacher, and these are the things you need to have on every report. So landfill name, owner operator, address, and facility site ID number. In talking about having a unifying identification code, we identified that there's outward facing portion of our website where facilities can go look up their FSID, and that's a good key number for identifying what facility you have, as well as including a topographic map of your site showing the areas with final cover with geomembrane or final cover without geomembrane. The corresponding percentages over the landfill surface. We picked a date of April 1st for submitting reports. We asked around solid waste, and we asked around air quality when reports were due, and it seemed like a lot of reports were due around this time. So that's we're also open to comments on reporting timelines too. Next slide, please. All right, so we get to the first exciting portion of our annual report.
Catherine?
Yes.
Sorry to cut you off here. It looks like we have a question from Heather. So we could go back to the previous
Sure,
slide.
yeah. Yeah. If you don't mind pausing a moment after each slide, then we could give you on the real-time comments and won't forget. So back to that, the annual reporting. I'm not seeing on here active phase or active surface and a definition of that.
Okay. So we're talking about on the topographic map, having an area, you're talking about like showing where the active part of the site is on the topographic
Yeah, and
map.
if it's annual, I think you're going to want to have the active phase, somehow temporally defined through that year. If this is an annual, I don't know if you're going to have quarterly reporting as well, but if you have the annual reporting, it seems like you're going to need to have the active phase each quarter shown on that, maybe overlapping zones, showing on that annual map.
That's a good comment. Yeah, considering how temporal the surface of the landfill is, how things change throughout the year, we're talking about how this is just a brief snapshot in time. Okay.
Catherine, it also looks like we have a comment or a question in the chat from Marnie, which I'll read out, which is, why require a topographic map versus an aerial or other image to show landfill areas? And I also just wanted to pass along that I got a comment that some folks were hearing some background noise when you were speaking. I'm not sure if we can do anything about it, but I just wanted to pass that along.
Okay, one sec. All right, I just had to talk to my next door neighbor. She's really popular today. So for a topographic map versus an aerial or other image to show, so discussions about the quality of the image and how we're able to display things, being able to align your map with like a certain set of GPS coordinates and having a good quality map was the discussion we had. Also knowing the elevations of the site is important. But certainly if there are opinions or comments about what kind of maps we should be looking for, that's I would really appreciate comments on that. Speaking from a prior service, military intelligence, so I love topographic maps. I love working with MGRS grid coordinates. So I'll be a real nerd about it if you want me to be. Does that answer the question though, Marnie?
Heather has her hand up.
Oh, okay.
To follow, I'm a geologist, so I love topographic maps too, and I do think there's validity in having a topographic map because then you can really see it. But I'm wondering if we're trying to sort of have a West Coast alignment, are they requiring a topographic or aerial or both, plan map or both in the California rules?
California just requires the topographic map. And this is pretty much verbatim what the language is from the California rule.
I do think there's utility in having consistent requirements from state to state. So I would say let's have the topographic map to be consistent with California, but if a plan map is also helpful, that would be a good second.
Okay, yeah, that's a great comment. Any more map talk? I'm here for it. Okay, we can move on to the next slide then. All right, so we're getting to our most exciting thing, annual reports, waste in place reporting. So the basic requirements that we have drafted so far in our draft rule language is the landfill status, active or closed, and the estimated waste in place in tons. That means the waste that you received for that calendar year, January through December, and then the total waste that you have on site. And you have to submit this waste in place report until you either hit that magical number of 450,000 tons or you close your landfill. Any questions on the waste in place report? All right. We'll move on to the next awesome report, and that is the heat input capacity calculation. Did we have my explainer slides, Bill?
Yes, Catherine, I think
Oh,
they
they're after. Okay. So I'll go into the explanation after. We'll just discuss the basics of the heat and capacity calculation. So once you've hit the magical number of 450,000 tons of waste, or if your closed landfill, 750,000 tons of waste in place, you must submit an annual landfill gas heat input capacity, where you are going to calculate the amount of methane that you are estimate the amount of methane that you are generating on site. You must do this HIC after you've hit 450,000 tons open or 750,000 tons closed, until you reach heat input capacity of greater than 3 million British thermal units per hour, or you submit a closure notification. And to note, once you submit your closure notification, if you're required to do a heat input capacity calculation, we'll take the initial values for what you have and project your heat input calculation, into the future to verify that you will not hit 3 million BTUs. Any questions?
I'll take a moment to read out what Bill put in the chat, just so everybody hears it, which is to note that the section numbers are as is drafted right now, but are subject to change. So any of the section references you see here are subject to change.
All right, we can move into the next slides where I explain a little about methane in a landfill. For those of you, I'm sure all of you here are experts, but just explaining a little about the uncertainty of calculating your methane generation. So in a landfill, waste decomposes in 4 phases. Your first phase, you initially dump the waste. It's got a lot of oxygen in there. The little bacteria that are decomposing the waste, they consume all that oxygen and they're producing higher amounts of carbon dioxide compared to methane. As those little bacteria continue to eat, consume the oxygen in the landfill kind of, goes down, and these little bacteria switch to methanogenic production. So they're anaerobic production. So you get aerobic, you're working out with lots of oxygen. Anaerobic, you're working out with less oxygen. But we can see that once we switch to that anaerobic function, the methane curve starts to go up. These phases can occur simultaneously in different areas of the landfill, even in the same cell of the landfill. And this decomposition really depends a lot on landfill conditions, moisture, temperature, as well as the composition of the waste in place. So there's a lot of things that go into it. It's very uncertain. So we move into the next slide. We can talk about our methodology that we're going to use for base level estimations of your heat input capacity. And that is the first order decay model promulgated by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, in 2006. EPA and CARB have adopted this methodology, and it just basically assumes that as along the life term of the landfill, a certain percentage of waste will decompose, and calculates, how much waste will remain, gives you a curve, your methanogenic curve for decomposition. So the inputs that we have for this basic calculation methodology are your waste in place data, your waste characterization data, and luckily Washington State has a great waste characterization study that's done every couple of years. We have fresh data about what percentage of waste is organic in your landfills. And then the decomposition rates, which mostly just depend on where your landfill is situated and the amount of rainfall that it gets. There are a couple models out there if you are interested in playing around with numbers. I know CARB has a great tool. California Air Resources Board has a great tool on their website. LandGem does do does do methane calculations too. We are leaning more towards a CARB-like tool to help facilities calculate their emissions. However, we are still open to comments about what type of tool or how facilities would like to go about calculating their heat generation.
I see
Any
that
questions?
Heather has their hand up.
Hello. I appreciate that Washington has an excellent waste characterization report. I use it all the time. It is terrific. However, it is not based on each landfill. So I think that this needs to be maybe better clarified, maybe even in definitions, but we definitely need to know what the landfill itself is receiving, not a generalized average number across the state, which is what the waste characterization provides. So I think we do want waste characterization for that particular landfill.
Yeah, and that's something we've been talking to facilities about, as well as with recent legislation coming about reducing organics that are going to landfills, that may change inputs for these calculations significantly. So any owners and operators out there, if you have comments about this, we would really appreciate it.
I'd like to expand on that for a second too. Heather, our solid waste management program does conduct waste characterization studies. If you're not aware, they hire someone to conduct these studies every 5 to 6 years. I'm not sure how often CARB has done these studies, but we are looking into using that waste characterization data because we do have a lot of data on this from our solid waste management program, which will help with our kind of building out the landfill gas calculation.
Hey, Bill, I appreciate that, but I study those reports. They're excellent, but they don't give you the information for each landfill, and each landfill could have a very different pattern or characterization than the overall roll-up for the state. So, and when they do those terrific every 5-year reports, they're looking at specific, they do certain landfills, but they don't do all of them, and they don't publicize that. So maybe you have behind the scenes information, but it's not going to be every landfill. So totally agree that they're useful for looking at the whole state, but they're not going to be useful for looking at each landfill from what I understand. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure they don't have that particular thing does not have information on each landfill every year. And that's what I think I'm seeing here is we really need to know what is, you know, to the best that they can do. I know they're not going to do necessarily an audit, although we'd love an audit. But they do know where they're getting their waste from.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Heather. And you are right. These aren't annual studies on every landfill. I think every 5 to 6 years when they conduct these waste characterization studies, it's a you know, a subset of landfills across the state.
But it's better than nothing. I'm so glad I'm glad we have that at least.
Well, just to hammer this, it isn't better than nothing. In this case, we actually do want to know what is in each landfill, and they do have manifests of knowing who's coming in. They may not have the exact percentages, but they know how much offal they're getting, how much, you know, this, that, and the other they're getting from different sources.
Yeah, we are working closely with our waste partners here at Ecology, and we have been looking at the types of data that they are getting too. So that separation, like where construction and demolition waste is separated out from like the general municipal solid waste. So we are looking at that and seeing where we can fine tune. And that's a really great comment.
I see that, Stephen, you have your hand raised. Feel free to share your comment or question.
Yeah, just a comment, I would suggest that when you're working through the rule, that you also think about how to address the actual observations from the landfill operation. As an example, if a landfill has got an effective gas collection system and is otherwise in compliance with everything else that the rule requires in terms of leaks or capture efficiency, and they actually measure an actual gas rate going to the control device. If that doesn't match the model, what does that mean? I mean, the models are tough, and you can actually measure the gas that's collected. It's part of the other part of the question is that represent effectively captured methane? And if it's not, doesn't match the model, what does that information tell you, or the landfill?
Yeah, there's a couple variations to this methodology out there that makes assumptions for like oxidation, gosh, that's a hard word, through the landfill cover. And I think it's general knowledge out there in the community that these models aren't perfect, and that sometimes the ground truth can be variable from what the model produces. Technology is getting up there. However, the model is what EPA and CARB have been working with, and it's what we've got right now. And in comparing the amount captured versus the amount calculated, there are some equations out there that deal with it, especially in the most recent iteration of the IPCC waste methodology. They do go into greater detail, and I've been working into digging that, but that's a good thing to put on our docket to look into. Thank you, Steve.
And it looks like Bill has linked the California Air Resources Board landfill gas tool in the chat, if you'd like to look at that.
Right. Some good comments today. All right, and so the next report would be the surface monitoring portion of the report. So if you have a landfill that you've reached that 3 million BTU per hour heat input capacity calculation threshold, or you're a landfill that already has a gas control and collection system in place, we're drafting a requirement. So for these quarterly monitoring reports, that would include at a bare minimum the date of the monitoring, the location of the monitoring, and the measurement concentration of methane and ppmv. Heather?
Sorry to be so talky today. Since we're going to be putting in a comment and strongly encouraging you to require drone monitoring, which would be over the entire landfill and especially the active area, or maybe not especially the active, anyway, across the entire landfill. So it seems like this language here would not be accommodating that. And also, I think there should be, in any case, a bullet that says method of monitoring.
I think that's a pretty good comment. I know we've got other method 51 that was recently approved by the EPA that approves drone monitoring, and we were heavily considering including that as an approved method for methane monitoring. So yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you, Heather. Otherwise known as the sniffer drone. Any other questions on the monitoring report? Great comment from Heather. Okay, we can move on. So the GCCS system, the bread and butter, the crowning glory of your landfill. So any owner and operator that would have a GCCS system in place, this is their proposed material, the report that Ecology has been working on. So it includes the total volume of gas collected, the average composition, actual methane percentage numbers, gas control device type, year of installation, rating, fuel type, and the amount of landfill gas combusted in each control device annually. Date of the gas collection and control system was installed in full operation. And then the percent methane destruction efficiency within the landfill for each gas control device. Type and amount of supplemental fuels if your landfill is not generating enough methane to burn off right. Sometimes you'll need a supplemental fuel. And total volume of landfill gas shipped off site and the composition collected and the recipient of the gas. Any questions on these reporting requirements for a gas controlled collection system?
And again, we do understand that this is a lot of information, so we appreciate you bearing with us and understand if you'd rather participate by submitting a written comment after you've had some time to gather your thoughts. And we'll share how to do that at the end of the presentation today, or the end of the meeting today.
All right, if we can move on to the next slide. Closure notification report, pretty similar to reports already required by CFR. So your landfill ceasing to accept waste, you must submit a closure notification within 30 days of ceasing to accept waste. So if you're a landfill that has greater than or equal to 450,000 tons of waste in place, you must submit a 30-year projection of your heat input capacity calculation, just to make sure that that methanogenic curve is going to peak above 3 million BTUs per hour. So the authority may request additional information as necessary to verify that the permanent closure is taking place in accordance with all local laws. And then once the closure report is submitted, no additional wastes must be placed or can be placed into the landfill without notifying the local authority.
And I did want to chime in here for 1 sec, Catherine. In regards to the second bullet point where you just see a blank space and an underline, we are still deciding on whether who's going to receive these reports. Based on our statutory language, it could be Ecology and or the local authority, which in some cases is Ecology, in some cases it's a local clean air agency. So any comments on that would also be appreciated on who's going to be requesting these or who's going to be receiving these reports as well as requesting records.
All right, I guess everyone's starting to get hungry.
We actually
lunch.
We actually do
Oh,
have
we gotta go to questions.
a question in the chat from Sue Ellen, which is, will the GCCS report also include how the landfill gas and any alternate fuel is transported or shipped off-site?
Bill, I can't remember the language. We go back to the GCS report, Nick, really quick. The volume. I don't know if we are including that.
Let me pull up the statute real quick here. Yes, we are still looking into that, but there's nothing drafted around that as of yet, Sue Ellen. So thank you for your comment.
Okay. Especially with a lot of the stuff coming out with e-RINs. It's an exciting time to have landfill gas. All right, we can move forward 2 slides. Equipment removal report. So within 30 days of well capping or removal or cessation of operating your GCCS, there's a requirement to submit your equipment removal report. Basically, you've got your equipment on site, you have all your source test reports, documenting, showing that your system has been installed for a minimum of 15 years, unless you can demonstrate to the satisfaction of the local authority that you are unable to, or that your new landfill is not producing enough methane to qualify for a control system. And then your surface emissions monitoring results that you will need to verify that the landfill surface methane concentrations do not exceed the limits set forth. We're looking at 200 ppmv for that threshold.
And once again, the sections we don't have filled out yet, those blank sections are sections we're going to be filling in when we draft language around the gas collection and control system, as well as monitoring requirements.
So does anyone have any feedback or questions on proposed equipment removal report language here? Again, you're welcome to raise your hand or pipe up in the chat.
Oh, John?
Yeah, sorry for the late question here. This isn't exactly removal, but if a landfill were making changes to its system, like replacing a flare with a slightly larger or smaller flare or something like that, where it's tweaking the equipment and maybe swapping out equipment, but not removing the system as a whole, would that trigger any sort of a reporting requirement?
In my vision, not for the equipment removal. Like this report is for the end of the gas control collection system life. That would be something that we might look at including in the GCCS report. So if you are, your gas production has gone up, you need to upgrade your flare, or you're changing out your open flare for an enclosed flare. That's something I would envision seeing in a regular GCCS report. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right. That's the most exciting report, I guess. Gas control collection system did its job. Bill's going to take over the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, that actually, it looks like we have another question here from Jennifer. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Thanks. Sorry, I was waiting for a general reporting question slide. So I guess I have a comment, and I would just like to go on record to point out that a lot of the information that we've discussed today under the record keeping and reporting requirements are already captured and reported by some landfills, depending on kind of where they're at and what they're doing. And I would encourage ecology to look for opportunities to leverage and align with those sources of data so that the landfills subject to this rule are not having to kind of double the effort for reporting. So looking at things like the timing of when this data is due and the format that it's due, just really encourage ecology to try to leverage those other resources.
Yes, thanks for your comment, Jennifer. We've had a lot of discussions about that, aligning some of these reporting and record keeping requirements for some of the larger landfills that already fall under the federal regulations, and that's something we're certainly going to keep looking into. So we're going to ease the burden of reporting and record keeping for some of these landfills that already report to the EPA on these things or to the local clean air agencies. So yeah, we really appreciate that comment.
And it looks like we also have a question in the chat from Rod, which is similar to previous question. Could you highlight any areas where the requirements differ or significantly expand on the statute? Rod, are you talking about for this specific equipment removal report or for the overall proposed reporting requirements? Overall reporting.
Thanks for clarifying, Rod. Yeah, a lot of this, for example, on this equipment removal report, the first paragraph there is statutory language, including the the 30 days of well capping or removal of cessation of the operation of the GCCS system, and the rest of the sections are added language. So for many of these sections, the equipment removal report or closure notification report gives 30 days. That is statutory language, and then we're just expanding on that based on what we need in the report. In regard to annual reporting, which includes the waste in place report, landfill gas heat input capacity, a surface emissions monitoring report, as well as GCCS operations. The annual report is required as part of our statute. It's going to be for the period of January 1st to December 31st. So that is statutory language. It'll be a report based on a calendar year. We've come up with all the elements, or continuing to come up with all the elements of what's going to be required in those reports, as well as reporting dates. For example, the annual report right now, we've drafted date of April 1st to align with some of the waste in place reporting that landfills have to do with the solid waste management program. Did that answer your question? Or if it's not, you're welcome. We could also, try to send out some materials here with, what's our statutory language and how it differs from our draft rule language, if it would be helpful. Any more questions on reporting? Okay, well, these last few slides here are going to be kind of just wrapping up our meeting today and talking about some next steps. So we showed this timeline slide on our last public meeting. So where we're at right now, we're in our rule development phase. We already had our first meeting on March 30th. Today is our second meeting. And we are going to be holding another meeting likely in mid-June, and we will be sending that invitation out next week. So fairly shortly. So you'll be receiving an invite for our third meeting where we'll be discussing monitoring and gas collection control system requirements. In October, we are tentatively looking at proposing rule language, and this will open our official comment period. We'll be holding public hearings, on which we hope you all will attend. We are looking to draft or adopt rule language, in April of next year. And then implementation of our rule is proposed for January 1st of 2025. Next slide. So here's a little bit more information on our upcoming meetings. As I said, we haven't scheduled our June meeting, but we will be scheduling that shortly. We'll be receiving more input on draft rule language, either based on some comments we received between now and then, as well as other drafted rule language. We'll be covering new drafted rule language on monitoring requirements, as well as gas control collection and system requirements. And then we'll be holding a fourth public meeting if needed, if we need to cover more material. Next slide. Here's our contact page. Feel free to contact me or Catherine or Nick at any time. Our emails are listed here, and this presentation will be going up on our web. It's already up on our web from our previous presentation, so please do not hesitate to reach out with any sort of questions you have based on this rulemaking or certain elements that we've discussed today. Okay, and here are some links, some helpful resources. The first one is our link to our rulemaking page. And then there's a link to our statute. I know, Rod, you had a question on some of the statutory requirements and how they differ from our drafted rule language. So we encourage you to look through the statute as well to read through some of the legal language of our authorizing statute. See, Heather has a question.
Yes, we are planning to submit informal comments relatively soon. And I'm wondering, are you going to be publishing the informal comments on your website, or how will people be able to see what everyone else is saying as well?
Yes, thanks for that question, Heather. That's a really good question. Yes, the comments will be published on our online comment system, and others will be able to see what's submitted on our comment system. I think we have a couple comments in there already. And this last link on this page here is a link to our online comment system. So we do very much encourage our stakeholders to submit comments online, so we can mull over those comments and other stakeholders can see what's been submitted as well. And I do want to also note, I noted this during our last presentation, that we do not respond to comments during this informal comment period, but of course we will be reading all these comments, and they are helpful to us in drafting our rule language. During our official comment period, after we've drafted after we proposed our rule, we will have to respond to all those comments, and we will be doing that when we adopt our rule. Thanks for posting that, Catherine. Catherine just posted a link in the chat to our online comment system.
We have a question in the chat from Cameron, which is there a good person to contact for more general landfill methane questions and data?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Cameron. You can reach out to me. I'm the rule lead on this rulemaking, and if it's a technical question that I can't answer, I will be sure to forward it to my staff, and it will get to the appropriate person. And I can just put my email in the chat right now. Thank you. All right. So we are essentially wrapping up here. Are there any more questions on what's been covered today, or, you know, general questions about our rulemaking? Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks everyone for your attendance today. We really appreciate all the questions and comments as we continue to draft rule language, and we highly encourage you to join us for our next meeting, as well as submit written comments on any part of our rulemaking, as we mentioned before.
I do just want to note that it looks like the original online comment site link was incorrect, and we've just added the correct comment site link in the chat, in case you'd like to copy that. We also have a question from Sue Ellen, which is, will you post the link in the chat on draft rule language? I think, Bill, if you'd like to speak more to that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question, Sue Ellen. Yeah, of course, if it's really important for you all to see what we've drafted so far. Our presentation, you know, covered the major elements, but not all of our draft rule language. We will be posting our draft rule language on our website soon. And we'll also be sending out an email after this meeting, letting everyone know that language is posted, as well as this presentation and some other resources from today.
And Bill, did you say that we should expect that sometime early next week?
Yes, early next week. The email should be going out on Monday or Tuesday of next week. Well, I guess that wraps it up. We're a little, we finished a little earlier today. I hope everyone enjoys their lunch.
Yes, thank you all so much for coming here today. We really appreciate you taking your time to offer input, ask questions. It helps us do a better job in rulemaking. I'm going to stop recording the presentation now.